This wasn't about mayors, it was about leverage. And it's happening now because Canada is navigating a period of economic pressure and global instability where options matter more than rhetoric. On February 4th, 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney sat down with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities' Big City Mayors Caucus. On the surface, it sounded familiar: housing, infrastructure, public safety. But listen to what was paired together and how it was sequenced. What emerges isn't a courtesy meeting. It's a map of the tools Ottawa is trying to use to widen Canada's room to maneuver, at home and by extension, abroad. Here's the core idea. Canada's leverage doesn't come from speeches on the world stage. It comes from capacity, concrete, water pipes, transit lines, permits, land, and the rules that decide whether cities can function safely enough to build at speed. That matters. Today we're going to stay grounded. No hype, no speculation. First, we'll lay out what's been publicly announced: numbers, dates, mechanisms. Second, we'll walk through the three levers Ottawa is pulling through cities: money, land and delivery, and rules. Third, we'll end with watch points, specific signals over the next 30 to 90 days that tell you whether this is moving from pipeline language to actual ground being broken. This is analysis based on publicly available reporting and official releases. Where interpretation is involved, it will be labeled as analysis. Facts stay facts. Quick context. In that meeting, Carney talked about nation-building projects, taking control of our destiny, and diversifying partnerships abroad. Then he moved, without pause, to community infrastructure, transit, health infrastructure, and housing delivery. Not as separate buckets, as one system. Because if Canada wants more external options, trade routes, investment resilience, supply flexibility, you don't start with declarations. You start with throughput. And Ottawa has put numbers behind that approach. The first lever is money. The federal government has described a Build Communities Strong Fund that would invest $51 billion over 10 years, followed by $3 billion per year ongoing, focused on local infrastructure. That scale is not accidental. It's large enough to signal seriousness, and large enough to force coordination. Once a fund reaches that size, provinces, municipalities, and agencies all have to decide whether they are aligning or stalling. And alignment changes the math. But money alone doesn't build anything. It buys the ability to build if the second lever is functioning. Which brings us to what mattered most in Carney's remarks: Build Canada Homes. He described it as just getting up and running, flagged that more authority would follow, and emphasized cutting red tape, fast-tracking approvals, and delivering not just affordable housing, but deeply affordable and supportive homes. This is the second lever: land plus delivery. Ottawa is positioning Build Canada Homes as a delivery mechanism: partnerships, financing, and land activation designed to move projects from planning to construction faster. Design to is the right phrasing. Outcomes depend on execution, but the mechanism is visible. And we already have a concrete example that shows what this is meant to look like. On January 7th, 2026, the federal government described a partnership with the City of Ottawa aimed at up to 3,000 homes, supported by up to $400 million, tied directly to streamlined approvals and cost reduction. Notice the wording, up to. That's not a delivered number. It's a capacity signal. But it tells you this isn't just conceptual. A deal structure exists: money, approvals, cost reduction, land activation. That's the point. Ottawa isn't just buying units. It's trying to buy speed. And speed is the binding constraint in Canadian housing. This is where a lot of coverage misses the mark by asking only one question: will this build X number of homes? That's a headline question. It's not an analytical one. The better question is simpler and harder. Does this create repeatable acceleration? Because if Ottawa can standardize these deals, land, approvals, financing, cost controls, then scale becomes possible. If it can't, Build Canada Homes risks becoming another administrative layer that coordinates without accelerating. Acceleration is the test. Now, before moving on, here's the anchor to hold on to. Nothing unlocks housing speed without delivery capacity. That applies to money, it applies to land, and it applies to rules. Which brings us to the third lever, rules. During the same meeting, public safety came up quickly. Carney referenced sentencing reform, bail reform, combating hate, cybersecurity, and reinforcing RCMP and border capacity. This is where analysis often collapses into absolutes. Avoid that. What we can say, clearly and factually, is what has been proposed. Bill C-14 had first reading on October 23, 2025. It proposes stricter bail and sentencing changes, including reverse onus in specified situations, meaning detention becomes the starting point unless the accused can show why release is justified. Those are the mechanics, not the outcomes. But the reason this sits beside housing and infrastructure is strategic, not rhetorical. Cities are the front line of public order. When disorder rises, repeat offending, visible instability, it doesn't just affect safety, it affects governance. You can't densify at speed if public trust erodes. You can't sustain disruption if residents feel the basics aren't holding. Municipal leaders have been explicit about this. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities has framed bail reform as a response to long-standing municipal calls for stronger public safety tools, while emphasizing continued collaboration. That framing matters. It tells you Ottawa is responding to pressure that shows up first at the city level. And it explains why federal legal levers are being pulled in parallel with delivery levers. The boundary here is important. Legislation is the easy part. Implementation is the hard part. Outcomes depend on enforcement capacity, court processes, resources, and consistency. So the accurate claim is not that bail reform will fix public safety. The accurate claim is that Ottawa is treating public order as a condition for delivery capacity. That's a shift. Pull the pieces together and the structure becomes clear. This meeting wasn't symbolic. It was transactional. Ottawa is saying, we will put scale on the table, money and mechanisms, if cities can move approvals and deliver. Cities are saying, we can deliver, but we need infrastructure capacity and public safety conditions that hold, because instability undermines everything else. Underneath that exchange sits a national objective. Build domestic capacity that makes Canada harder to pressure externally, because pressure only works when alternatives don't exist. If Canada can build housing faster, stabilize urban capacity, and support trade corridors with real infrastructure, its external options widen. Labor markets loosen, costs become less volatile, supply chains become less brittle. That's leverage, not rhetoric, capacity. Now, the reality check. This can fail in predictable ways. It can fail if the Build Communities Strong Fund remains a funding announcement without project readiness. It can fail if Build Canada Homes can't scale beyond a handful of early agreements, or if land activation stalls in bureaucracy. It can fail if fast-track approvals collide with hard limits, construction labor, materials, municipal staffing. And it can fail if public safety reforms remain symbolic, either because legislation stalls or implementation lags. These aren't partisan critiques, they're mechanical failure modes. And because they're mechanical, they're observable. So here are the watch points, the signals that matter over the next 30 to 90 days. First, additional Build Canada Homes partnerships. Name cities, identified sites, clear timelines. Specificity is strength. Second, language shift. Watch for movement from pipeline to breaking ground, with locations and dates. Momentum shows up in repetition. Third, C-14's parliamentary and implementation signals. Not rhetoric, process, guidance, capacity, because this meeting wasn't about optics. It was about tying national ambition to municipal capacity. If that linkage holds, Canada's options expand. Pressure gets more expensive. and the country becomes harder to coerce because it can actually move. And that changes everything.